Well, my name is Michael Campbell. I work for an organization called the Center for Creative Leadership. We have a campus in Colorado Springs. Has anyone ever heard of that particular organization? You have?
Mm-hmm.
From just walking around? Where did they come?
My mom used to work there.
Oh, who was your mom?
Sue O'Brien. She was like a program coordinator.
Okay. No, yeah, I do remember.
So you know Gina Broom
Yes.
and Suzanne Ernster?
Yes.
Yeah, you guys are
Very
like
good.
best friends. Yeah, they're like my friends
So
too.
this is like the St. Mary's connection, right? Is that right? Or
Yeah, their kids went there.
Okay.
But, yeah.
Okay.
So,
So Center for Creative Leadership is a fairly unique organization because it's dedicated exclusively to understanding the practice and delivery of leadership for the benefit of society worldwide. So it's a nonprofit organization that works sort of like a university and then sort of like a research institution. So what do? Part of what we do is we bring leaders in from all over the world and we put them through a leadership course, right? So they learn about self-awareness, they learn about how to give feedback, they learn about things like coaching. Then we have another side of the house that's exclusively devoted to research, okay? So this is where we sort of come up with new content, where we're trying to explore what else is there to know about leadership. You know, a lot's already been said, a lot's already been written. So various topics that we look at on the research side of the house. And so that's where I exist, is on the research piece. And I also happen to teach a course here at UCCS, so Topher and Ashley are here, so I'm debating whether to let them off the hook Thursday, not have to attend since they have to hear two of my lectures, but I'll probably make them come anyway. I know the topic of this class is around gender leadership. By no means an expert. I know that many of the guest speakers that are going to be speaking with you are actually going to be speaking from personal experience. We'll probably make some pretty interesting stories. For me, I don't think, enough interesting personal experience to draw upon that it would be a very compelling conversation to have with each of you today. But I do have what I think is some fairly interesting research that I think pertains to what you're studying. It's fairly unique. It also has what I think the added connection of the fact that this study was a study that I did in grad school. So I went to UCCS for my undergrad and my graduate. In fact, I just finished my graduate about a year ago. So it's fairly fresh content too. But in terms of research interest, and it'll connect to the presentation here a little bit, one of the things that I'm really interested in from a research focus is senior executive leadership, right? So leadership at the very top of organizations. And what does that look like, and how is that different from what leadership looks like at other levels in the organization? So the data that I'm going to be talking to today in the study was pulled from a group of senior executives. So these are executives from all around the world. Some names you would probably recognize. Some you would have no idea, but they do amazing work throughout the globe. So does that sound like a good approach? So you exchange, you use one lecture, but you gain another here. Is that going to be okay? All right, sure. Silence is... so, I can tell, I can feel the energy. The study I'm going to talk about today has a catalyst for it was this number right here, 450. And when I was doing some literature review around specifically sort of senior executives and the idea of gender, what I had found in a study, this was from 2006, that 450 was actually the number of Fortune 1000 companies that had 0 women executives. Okay, this is 0 women in the executive suite. And I found that fairly compelling. So this was done in 2006, again, this particular study. So I found that interesting that some of the top organizations in the world, almost half of them don't have women executives. Does that surprise anyone in this room? Say more. Why does it surprise you?
Well, it surprises me just because based on the fact that you'd think that nowadays you'd have a large amount of female top-level managers who would be more than capable of handling top executive positions.
Right, so that seems like that's a large number to you. It would be less.
Oh, yeah.
Other thoughts on the 450? Surprises? Yeah.
Like, out of how many, is there not a percentage, or like 2% of?
So 1,000 organizations, right, in the Fortune 1000?
Okay, that's what I was asking.
Okay,
I was
yeah.
just the name of that was actually.
So what I also found is that this idea of a discrepancy in women in particular at the executive ranks is not a new trend. So this was some research that was done by a guy named David DeVries, who actually worked at the Center for Creative Leadership and did some very cool work on executive selection. So how are executives chosen for leadership positions? And what he said in 1993 is that there are no organizations that we know of that explicitly state that they exclude candidates for executive roles from specific demographic groups. However, women and minorities are moving into executive ranks very slowly. So that was 1993. We were seeing the trend in 2006. There doesn't seem to be a lot of movement in this particular area. So that was a little bit of the catalyst for what I wanted to study, which was particularly around why aren't women executives moved into more senior roles? What might be some of the issues? And since I was a communications person, I tried to study it from a communication perspective. So this was actually presented in 2008 as part of a series of presentations that was called Gender Matters, Gender Matters. That's pretty dramatic, right? Question, statement. Okay, thank you. So exploring differences in how leaders describe candidates. So this was done in 2008. It'll look a little dated presentation-wise, but one of the things that I started off with, and this is what I imagine each of you are looking at, are sort of, what are sort of the stereotypic gender styles of leadership? And if I were to summarize the literature that I reviewed, it would be this idea that women lead in an interpersonally oriented style, men lead in a task-oriented style, right? Have you guys been familiar with sort of the interpersonal versus task relationship in leadership? Does that jive with what you've been learning?
We haven't actually got to that chapter yet.
Oh, okay.
We're going to be getting there.
Oh, okay, we just get the chapter now. So.
Absolutely.
Awesome.
As you read that, does that make sense? Is that your sense when I think about interpersonal style? So women lead in a way that is more about the relationship. Men lead in a way that's more focused on the task. Resonate? Say a little bit more. Why resonate for you?
Well, I just think about like conversations when you have like the difference in conversation between men and women, and a lot of times like women will be like, oh, well, what are you feeling about this? And like, what does this mean to you? When guys are much more like, this is what needs to get done. If we need to accomplish this in the conversation, this is what we are trying to accomplish. When women are more like, expand on that and let me see it and look into your life, you know? So
We just, Caleb just wrote that on about his talking point, basically, in terms of stereotypical association. Where are you, Caleb?
Right.
Yeah, so that's basically, we just talked about that a week ago with communal and agentic, in terms of stereotyping and association. And so those styles are very similar to the interpersonal and task orientation.
Yeah.
To be honest, I don't really relate to it. I'm kind of on a lot at my job to like delegate to every single person that I work with, but I don't just sit there in like a task-oriented style. Like I'm like, and even compared to other guys who like try to do it as well, like I definitely focus more on the relationships that I have like with these people because they're all my friends too. So like, or I want them to be all my friends as well. So it's, I mean, I'm sure there's acceptance to the rule, but for me that doesn't really resonate.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point, right? So these aren't one or the other, right? It's a continuum. And so what you would say as you looked at the research is that, if we looked at sort of a normal curve, right, that men tend to be on the more task side, women tend to be more on the interpersonal side, right? But there's all sorts of levels on that particular continuum. Is one better than the other? This is an opinion-based question. Is one style better than the other?
Nope.
I think it
Say more.
depends.
Well, don't you have to have both? I mean, you gotta understand what your employees need to be a good leader. So you have to have some interpersonal oriented style, but then you also have to be task oriented in order to make the money, pay bills, and do all that kind of stuff. So I think you need both to be a decent leader.
Okay. Other thoughts? Other hands back here?
I was just saying, like, I don't think, I agree with him. I think it needs to be a mixture. And it also depends on, like, the job, like, what your tasks are for the job and the atmosphere that you're working in. I don't think you can really say, like, one's better than the other.
Yeah? Your thought?
that's what my talking point pretty much says, is that like, do leaders show more of those qualities that like men have, or that they show more of what women have? And if you look at it, like a good leader, depending on situation, uses maybe more of the, you know, task related style, and then so that just is more proof to the fact that a leader is not gender based.
Yeah.
Well, there are also jobs like in the military, which I wasn't thinking about when I answered the first time. Like jobs like that, you can't really take emotion into it. You've got to do your job. And so in situations like that, I think that maybe a task-oriented style is the only way to go. So I guess it just, like she said, it depends on the context.
Yes, there's a theme about, context, situationally based, but, are you adaptable to be able to go to each approach as necessary? So what's interesting, what we find in my business, which, we sell leadership development in some ways, is that, a lot of the problems that we experience are up here in organizational life. So a lot of the things that we're helping leaders deal with is the interpersonal aspect of it. So on average with leaders, that seems to be the more difficult part as opposed to tasks. So I also wanted to know a little bit about executive selection. So again, think about it as hiring. We've all been through a job interview. We all know what that process looks like. But what does that process look like at the highest organizational levels? And so that's what I was interested in looking at. There's not a ton of research in this particular area. And as you can imagine, it's probably pretty difficult to learn about it, because how are you going to get access to these people? How do you have the ability to watch what a selection process looks like? But one of the things that we do know from research around executive selection is that executives use hard skills to describe a candidate's strengths and soft skills to describe a candidate's weaknesses. So what do we mean by hard skills? Hard skills are things like degrees, about like technical expertise, international experience. These would be things like hard skills, so more related to the task aspect of the job. So when leaders are talking about why they selected someone, they tend to talk about these sort of credentials as strengths. When they talk about weaknesses, they talk more about the interpersonal aspects. How well is this person going to be as a leader, right? How well is this person going to be a fit within this organization? Are they a team player? So when we talk about weaknesses, a lot of what we recognize is in this soft skills area. And so what you find at the executive level is that most people have a baseline of technical expertise, hard skills. That's sort of, that's your ticket into the dance, but it's really on the soft skills side that you're able to differentiate yourself as a leader, particularly at the most high levels. So let me get into the study a little bit. So it's a little bit complex, so slow me down if you have questions. If I was going to pay you $200,000 to this group to help me design a simulation that would help me understand how executives choose candidates and whether diversity plays a role in that choice, what would be your consulting advice to me? How would you earn your money? How would you design such a simulation? We probably need some candidates to evaluate, right? We probably need some executives that would be able to evaluate those candidates. We probably need some type of sort of fictitious organization that everyone would be able to study from, so maybe a case study. How would we study diversity? How would we know to do that? Thoughts? Yeah.
I feel like different candidates that are like diverse, like completely different from each other, like race, background, gender, age, type of
Okay.
pretty diverse.
So you have different candidates that are that display some sort of different diversity. Yeah.
Wouldn't that be shown just even through the application process? I've learned in other courses that even a name in the application process, the last name Sanchez, can get you booted for some reason in a lot of organizations. So I mean, if you took real executives that were gonna hire people for their real companies,
Mhm.
not just some case study, I think you notice a lot of those are gonna be pushed aside as opposed to the Bryans or Lucy's or whatever.
I think it depends. So at the executive level, I would probably say that's not the case because it's a different type of process. You know, they use different sources like search firms, different networks and things like that. So maybe at other levels in an organization, but probably not so much at the executive level. Okay, well, so this is what we did. So this is what we paid a consultant to be able to design, is a simulation where we would be able to bring in executives. They would have a common organization that they would be able to read about and understand. And they would have 4 candidates from which to choose a new president of one of the divisions. Okay? So that's the simulation that we had people go through. We had written descriptions of each of the candidates. Okay? So each candidate has a background, a resume. You know, you can read about their experience. You can also read about how others think about them. Okay? So we have detailed information about the candidates. What we then did is created a computer-based simulation. Okay? Where individual executives would be able to sit in front of a computer and they would be able to evaluate these 4 candidates. And they would have actors portraying the candidates that would be played through videos. Okay? They would make an individual selection. Who do I as an individual think would be the best person for this job? Then we put them together into groups and they had to come to a group decision about that. And we videotaped those conversations that they had about the candidates. Does that make sense? You with me so far? Okay, so who do we include in this? As I mentioned, working at the Center for Creative Leadership, we have the benefit of having these types of leaders come to us. So these are all very high-level leaders in the top 1, 2, or 3 levels of their organization. Okay? When we looked at the gender aspect of it, we looked at 2 things. Who was selected first, and who was selected as not acceptable. Okay? I was concerned with 2 candidates, a male and a female. And what we saw was that the male was selected 18 times as the top candidate by these groups. The female candidate was selected 11 times. Okay, so already there's a discrepancy there in how often these senior executives chose the male candidate versus the female candidate.
And all things equal in terms of qualifications, experience, everything.
Not only all things equal, they were the exact same candidate. All we changed was the face. So all the credentials, all the descriptions, everything was exactly the same. The only thing that was different was the face and the actor that portrayed the candidate. The groups could also select whether a candidate was not acceptable, meaning they wouldn't hire them under any circumstances. A little bit more even spread here. So the male 34 times, the female 31 times was indicated as not acceptable. So what I did is, I did a content analysis of descriptions for why these groups made a first choice or a not acceptable choice. And I looked at how they described the leader and what did that look like. I also then reviewed 2 of the videotape selection committees to see how do people talk about it. Okay, so how did it happen in real time? And what were some of the conversations that happened about these 2 candidates in particular? Okay?
And what does this sound like that we just read about with the essays and everything?
Goldberg paradigm.
So say more about the movie.
The Goldberg paradigm, they just studied this in one of their chapters, where that there were blank essays written by males or females, and then they changed the names, and of course the essays written by females were evaluated positively when they just changed the name if they wrote them, but when the female name was put on them, they were evaluated more negatively, unless they were about a female topic.
Okay.
so it was a similar thing that's called the Golden Parent, and it was a study done a while back, and kind of a foundation or something similar to this. That they just were learning about, kind of a foundational study.
Yeah, so very similar methodology to that, it sounds like. So as I mentioned, in our simulation, we had 4 candidates that the groups could choose from. We had a white male by the name of Cooper, okay? And we had a white male by the name of Davidson. And these characters never changed, they were always the same. We also had a candidate named Maleka. And as I mentioned, we had a white male version. We also had a white female version. Again, the exact same candidate, just a different actor or actress portraying him. And then we also had a third candidate by the name of Thompson that actually had 3 variations that we looked at, which was white male, white female, and an African American male. So, my study really just focused on this dynamic right here, between the white male and the white female. Partly because this character is kind of a jerk. And I wanted to see, for a jerky character, are there differences in how they're evaluated based on gender? Okay? So, this was the white male Maleka. This was the white female version. So this is what the executives saw when they went through the simulation. Okay? So, demographic-wise, we did the best we can to sort of match up. Actor portrayal-wise, we did the best we could that they would portray each other similarly. So, first question that I had, how do selection committees describe hard skill strengths and soft skill strengths for their top choice? So, when these candidates were chosen first, how were they described? Why were they picked first by these committees? And so, a lot of similarity between how both the male and the female were described in terms of their strengths, okay? Both of them had high functional expertise. Both of them also had international experience, which were key to this particular position, okay? Also, both were considered change agents. Is that labels? Does that make sense what a change agent is? Have you heard that before? Change agent is like the nice way of saying jerky character, I think, because the change agent is oftentimes the leader that comes in when things have gone wrong, and they sort of do whatever is necessary to make sure that a turnaround happens in an organization, okay? And they often don't stay very long in that organization. So that's what a change agent is. What was interesting is that for the male, so let's talk about differences now. When senior executives described why they chose the male, they often talked about his technical expertise, okay, because he's an engineering background, and they often talked about his leadership ability related to being a change agent. What you didn't see with the female candidate was any description of her technical expertise, okay? So they never once said that's why we chose her, because she's technically competent. And you never once said anyone described her general leadership ability as a reason for why they chose her. So that was one of the first differences that I encountered. Even when the female was selected first, there were differences in how she was described versus the male. What about when they were unacceptable? How did they describe their hard skills versus their soft skills, right? What were the reasons that they gave when they said, we're not going to hire either of these executives for anything, okay? It was exclusively soft skills that they described, okay? There was no weaknesses on the hard skill side that were ever mentioned for these people. That gets back to what I was saying. The technical skills at this level are just sort of your ticket in. You have to have that. But both of them were described as arrogant, radical, poor integrity, and ethics. Okay? There's actually a mention hidden in the data that both of these candidates have ties to the Polish mob. Right? So that's why poor integrity and ethics comes up at some point. Okay? Some leaders see it, some leaders don't. But very similar in how they were described soft skill-wise, why they weren't acceptable. Here were some interesting differences though, okay? The male version of the character was often not acceptable because they thought it was too high of a risk. So this is the type of language that they use to describe it. And this idea that he's just not a cultural fit, okay? He's not going to fit in with this organization as we have evaluated it, okay? But a different story with the female. She was often described as abrasive and aggressive as the reasons for why she was an unacceptable candidate. But you didn't see an overlap in those descriptions. Thoughts on that?
That kind of goes along with a lot of things in the chapter, right? You know, that resistance to female leadership that chapter 25 is on.
We'll keep moving. Oh, so there were also some fairly colorful descriptions of each of these, and this was equal. So the male was called a jerk and a sleazeball at some point. The female version was called a nice queen and a chainsaw. So I don't know what a chainsaw is. So if that gives you a little bit of indication of what these characters are.
Yeah, I can honestly say I have not heard what chainsaw.
Chainsaw is a.
You're such a chainsaw.
So here was one of the big ahas for me. Okay, so if you walk away, this will probably be a theme throughout the entire course, I would guess, is that it appeared that some behaviors in men were considered more acceptable, and those same behaviors were deemed less acceptable in a woman. Okay, so aggressive and leadership style for the male candidate were often seen as strengths. We want him to be aggressive. We want him to have this sort of aggressive leadership style. But for the female candidate, it was often listed as a weakness. Exact same descriptors. So that was what they wrote when they described these candidates.
Excuse me.
Yes?
When you say they, what was that group? Were they primarily men and women, or men or women? Or?
That's a good question. So they were primarily men.
Okay.
So if you think about it, it's probably about 88% were men, 12% were women. There were never an occasion where two women were in the same group.
And you said you watched the conversations of the deciders, and did you feel that women were being influenced by the men in those groups?
No. So never once did the senior executives, particularly the women that come through, I don't think they'd be influenced by anyone that they didn't want to be influenced by. So that wasn't an issue as far as my observations. So how do the selection committee describe a candidate's hard skills and soft skills? So this, again, is when I was watching the videos, right, of these conversations, what were some of the themes that had emerged out of that? Okay, so for the male, there was this idea of risk versus results with him, and this is how they talked about him. Okay, so one of the women said, he's obviously visionary, a bit tenacious, but in his story there kept appearing examples of him not being good with people, of him being a one-man band, and I worry about his ability to translate and bring the board with him. Okay, so for the male, it's this idea of if we bring him in, he may get results, but there's a risk on the human side, okay, on the interpersonal side of it. There was also some rationalizing that was going on. And so I have a young son, so I'm used to reading out loud, so you just have to tolerate that when I do that. So Susan said, I don't like Maleka. I don't think I'd invite him over for dinner. And then Hans said, I understand you don't like him as a human being. I don't like him either as a human being. I don't think he's ever going to be my friend. But then you have sort of this rationalizing going on, saying, Phil jumping in and saying, well, he's a friend and supporter of the ballet and opera. That's built into the simulation. Works for Habitat for Humanity. I think it's just a professional persona that he's got to put up there. Okay? So he's justifying the behavior. And then George chimes in and says, well, it's like Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Okay? So there's this sort of rationalizing that's going on about this particular individual around his interpersonal behavior. So what about risk versus results with the female candidate? Same candidate. So this was one of the descriptions here with the conversation. She came on really strong, and I really got screwed here. Plus she had a bad attitude, but she carried some nice credentials with her. So again, this idea that the credentials, the hard skills, looking pretty good, but for her, there was some questions about her attitude, about her interpersonal skills. There was also this theme about that there was no middle ground with the female candidate, right? That it was sort of this all or nothing that was going to be happening. So she's a hell of a wild card that's either going to pay off big dividends, but I don't think there's a middle ground for her. She's a winner or an absolute loser. Okay? So there was no, let's bring this person along. There was no sort of discussion. This person's opinion was, it's all or nothing with this person. So we're taking a big risk. Okay? There was also what I like to refer to as like vivid imagery with each of these candidates. So the way that they described and the way that they talked about them. So here's an example. So John says, how much pain do you want to accept in order to change? Pain, that's a loaded word. He was described as a tough taskmaster, a workaholic who kind of leaves blood on the floor as he pressed on to execute his vision. Leaves blood on the floor. These are the types of conversations they're having about this character. And then Susan chimes in and says, with Meleka, we have to destroy to gain. So there was, this candidate elicited a lot of what I would call sort of emotional language as they were describing. This is how they described the male. Here were some of the vivid imagery for a description of the female candidate. Okay, that Meleka's a ball buster, that she's a wild, wild, wild lady. That's 3 wilds. And they talked about being scared. I mean, they used that word. I'm scared of what this decision might look like. So look at some of these descriptions in terms of soft skill weaknesses. So this was from the conversation. Not being good with people, a tough taskmaster, not a fit in the company. Versus what I think is a little bit stronger language around a bad attitude, so abrasive, so aggressive, screwed by our last organization. I sensed a little softer language here. I don't know, what do you guys think? Just based on that. Some head nodding? What are you thinking? You're nodding here. Yeah.
Oh, I think that they're attacking the female character more than, I mean, they're just kind of making general comments about how he's not a good fit, and they're saying she has a bad attitude, she's abrasive and so aggressive, and
yeah, so it seems to be a different. I agree with that. Yeah.
It seems to me like they're trying to rationalize why not to pick her.
By using stronger language?
By using stronger language, literally justifying and rationalizing, this is why, and we're actually going to formulate it in words.
And why do you think that may be the case for the female versus the male?
Just based on the impressions of what they think a female leader should look like, basically the stereotype.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. So other thoughts on this particular finding? So this is sort of how I summarized the study when I put it together in terms of exploring these differences. What we found was that even when the selection criteria was exactly the same, the conditions were exactly the same, candidates are described in different ways based on gender. At least this particular candidate was. So we found evidence of that. So what do we do with that? So from the perspective of an organization like the Center for Creative Leadership, our job is to say, how do we take something like this type of research and apply it in a way that actually helps practicing leaders? And so part of it was this continuing theme of awareness, right? So how can we make executives, particularly during selection decisions, more aware of the differences in language they use when they evaluate candidates? Because what we might argue is that they're not even aware that they're using these sort of two different styles of language when they're describing or talking about candidates. So that's sort of the research. I tried to make it as quick and painless as possible. So, I'm open to questions about, this work, these findings. If you think there's other areas of interest that should be explored, I'm open if you wanted to talk about other research in the area that CCL may be doing. So I really leave the floor to you, but again, I just thought this might be an interesting, at least from a research or relatively speaking sense, way to talk about other knowledge around gender and leadership. Yeah.
It seems like this is, like within the last 10 or 15 years, just starting to be looked at on a studyable or evaluatable level. Do you think that the more research that's done and the more theories that we can come up with, the more knowledge that, like classes like this even, do you think it's going to start changing more rapidly as a result of that knowledge? Or do you think that's why we've been stuck in that phase for so long, just because nobody's ever known about it?
My personal opinion, I'll break it up. I think things like creating awareness, like a class, either something like this or other interventions throughout a leader's journey or career. My personal opinion is that helps, or that's really the only thing that we can do to have impact on it. To your question about the more and more research that we do we think? No, I don't think so, because unless you have a way to apply what you're learning in some way, then it just becomes academic at that point, right? And so there's a lot of people that know a lot of stuff about gender leadership that practicing managers and business leaders have no idea about. So how do you get it to them? What's the delivery mechanism? Yeah.
Do you feel that do you feel that men judge women leaders more harsh, or women judge women leaders harsher? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. I'm trying to think from my experience what I've observed. I've had a sense when we have executives in the classroom and there's maybe one woman leader in there and it's a bunch of men, so let's say one woman to about 10 men, that they feel very comfortable in that environment and are used to that. Okay? That executive women at that level are comfortable in that space, and so comfortable that when there are multiple women, there does seem to be, in my opinion, some competing that goes on between them in terms of, I don't say who's the smartest or who's the most successful, but just sort of that natural competition that emerges about what do you know and what's your job and what do you do. But when it's one woman with a group of males, you don't see that. I don't see that as much.
Doesn't that kind of go against the basis of what we've been taught, though, that men are more, they want to win all the time, whereas women don't necessarily care about being that competitive? Doesn't that kind of go against all that?
So, what do you think? I mean, how would you
I think it
describe
goes
it?
against it.
But I mean, why?
Well, it's just, I know plenty of women that are more competitive than I am. I just think there's a lot of theories that we learn and a lot of stuff in the book that it just doesn't coincide with life as a lot of us know it.
Mm.
So I don't know if things are changing so rapidly that the books can't keep up, or we just have a hard time wrapping our head around. We learn one thing and then our experiences and your experiences even tell us something different. So.
Well, if I was going to put on my researcher hat and say, let's talk about what kind of question we would ask with that, I think it would come back to the question of adaptability. So if most leaders at the most senior levels are men, then if you think about, even something like identity theory, right, or how you adapt your behavior to that, it's likely, or we might hypothesize, that successful women executives are able to display that more aggressive competitive behavior in a way that does not sort of turn off others. Okay? So is there some sort of adaptive behavior that happens that leads some women to do that? Because to your point, there's not that many at the top, right? That's what we started off talking about.
And I would also think that, you know, if you're trying to think, you know, when we talk about the labyrinth, when there's women that do find their way through it to levels that are high at the top, and they do get comfortable there, and they may feel that they're, you know, a minority group there, and then they start to see more and more women finding their way there too. They may feel that's exactly what we want to happen, but then when it does happen, the normal human instinct is to feel a bit threatened, because you've gotten used to being a minority group, and all of a sudden you're not a novelty anymore. And so I think that there is some element of human nature that you start to feel that you're not special anymore. And so I think that there is somewhat of an instinct to try to differentiate yourself again and become special again and different again. So what does human nature do? Well, you start to try to puff up your feathers a little bit and differentiate yourself and among the group. And how do you set yourself apart? Well, you try to play on your strengths and be a little competitive and set yourself apart and maybe be a little bit, you know, prideful and bragging about your, you know, what you've done and what you've accomplished. And then what are you doing? Well, you're displaying those masculine qualities of assertiveness and aggressiveness and competitiveness, and pretty soon you're according to role congruity theory, you're in that other role.
I'll ask my global leadership folks. So do you think, what would be a global perspective that we would think about this gender dichotomy? This is a pop quiz for them.
Well, it's hard to say. Like we learn power distance and hierarchy of other countries are so different when it comes to men and females, so it's hard to say.
Yeah, I think it would be very interesting to take this study and do it somewhere else. And just see what the results are that you get back, like in Japan or any Eastern country. I would like to see what happens, because I assume the results will be much different.
They passed.
Or Japan.
Well, yeah.
But we're getting to, when we get to chapter 8, we look at this, when I was saying before about tasking interpersonal, we haven't quite gotten into the nuts and bolts of that yet, but when we get into chapter 8, we look at strictly, do men and women lead differently? We pose that question. And that's what, you know, my dissertation kind of looked at that when I went through my PhD program, and looked at leadership differences between transformational and transactional and context and perceptions of leadership differences, and very similar to some of the things you looked at doing focus groups and perceptions of leadership preferences and that students have. So we'll kind of revisit some of these things, looking through the lens of leadership styles, you know, transactional and transformational and things like that, and in different contexts, like in the corporate context, in the educational context, which have gender, you know, kind of gender attributes, because again, we look at what's female dominated, what's male dominated, and things like that.
Like some things that I've heard of is when people like understand that their results aren't going to be anonymous, or not necessarily anonymous, but they're going to have kind of impact on research. Is that a lot of times they'll skew more towards the middle of the road thinking, something that people will relate to. So do you think that if this wasn't a theoretical company that you made up and theoretical candidates and something like, and that you did this exact same experiment, but in those executives like actual office, they're real places, do you think the numbers would have been skewed more towards men? Like, do you think it would have gotten worse from there, or do you think that that they were being relatively honest?
Well, if you ask them, they're being relatively honest.
No, yeah, exactly.
Okay,
That's the whole problem. Because they're going to make the decision based on what they think is right. but would have been like significantly more skewed in their own office? Or
So, it's hard to measure, but what we can measure are sort of outcomes. So just like that 450 number, we can see that it's not happening in a very tactical sense. And so, to your question, I don't know the answer to, but what I would say is that the output would indicate that there is a bias, at least in those Fortune 1000 organizations, at the top of the house. Now, what I tend to have seen in the literature around this is that there are more women in middle leadership, or middle management positions. That seems to be the growth area, but it's at the top where I was most interested in that you're not seeing that type of output yet.
have you considered doing like research into that? Kind of like more of a, I guess, I mean, there's obviously problems with doing it, having it not be a simulation, having it be realistic, but have you ever considered?
No, yeah, absolutely. I mean, and that comes with just its host of challenges, as you might imagine. Getting access. There's also sort of, human resource legal issues that come into play in those types of situations as well. But just so you know the dichotomy here, if you remember, I said we also had a third candidate that also had a white female and an African American male. For that candidate, the white female is chosen most often, and the white male is chosen least often. So that particular candidate is very different from the Maleka candidate we just talked about, right? Much more of what we would call a transformational leader, visionary, good interpersonal style, but across the board, regardless of gender, right? And so the executive leaders tend to pick her more often. And you know what they say about the male, why they don't pick him? They don't write it down, but what they tell us afterwards? He's too wimpy. He's too wimpy. So, but yeah, lots of interesting findings from this particular simulation that we're doing. And then I think what I was hoping and was pleased that Topher and Ashley alluded to is that these sort of gender leadership I think is also a culturally based phenomenon. Right? So depending on the cultural lens that you take, gender and leadership may have very different impacts, very different rules of engaging. And so another thing to be aware of as we become more international, as each of you may be having experiences not only on campus, but in your career lives as well, there are different rules sometimes for different societies. And so it's not only navigating it here from what I would call a Western perspective, but how does it look different in other regions? And to Topher's point, if we ran this simulation someplace else, what is it? Finland has there's a cultural dimension called masculinity versus femininity. Finland, I think, scores highest on the feminine side. I get very different results than what we did with a primarily U.S. sample of executives. So that's another wrinkle that you have to consider, I think, particularly with gender, is how it plays out cross-culturally. And you may be getting that as well, too.
Yeah, we talked about the Scandinavian countries in general. They're doing really well on their equal race, trying to get a really equal ratio of female to male executive and political, positions.
Is there anything else? Want to watch the movie?
They'll be sorry. I'm just kidding.
Well, I appreciate the time. I know it's always tough to have a guest speaker come in and know what they're going to talk about. So I appreciate the attention and the opportunity to talk about some of this work. To the point earlier, a lot of times it just gets filed someplace. No one ever gets to hear about it. So it was fun for me. So if we just base success on my own gratification here, we did a pretty good job.
Thank you so much.
All right, thank you.